Okay. Hi.
Wait, Gina, a little bit. I'm going to introduce you to the audience here. Voy a hacer la introducción en español porque también estamos en vivo por Facebook Live, entonces no sé si hay personas viéndonos que no hablan inglés, pero por lo que veo sí todos hablamos español. Bueno, Gina no, pero ya le conté lo que estoy diciendo en este momento. Les doy la bienvenida a todos y todas y a todos a este conversatorio que va a constar de una pequeña presentación de alrededor de unos 20-30 minutos sobre Gina y su trabajo. Ella está completando ya en la última etapa de su PhD en Transgender Studies en la Universidad de Edimburgo. Ella es galesa, pero está viviendo en Edimburgo hace ya 5 años más o menos, o 6. Nos va a contar un poco de su historia también, de su trabajo, así que todos sean muy bienvenidos a esta actividad. En la primera etapa, como les digo, va a haber una presentación, y en la segunda etapa vamos a poder conversar, hacer preguntas a Gina. Si es que hay personas también en Facebook que quieran hacer sus preguntas, las pueden dejar en un comentario. Y yo, si es que sus preguntas no son en inglés, yo las puedo traducir para facilitar la conversación con Gina. Así que eso es. Comenzamos. Gina, I'm going to start sharing my screen now with your presentation.
Okay.
So whenever you're ready, you may start.
Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me for this talk. My name's Gina. I'm a PhD student in trans studies and English literature. I come from Wales in the UK. I started my PhD research in 2016, and I also came out as transgender in 2016. And I think those two things are quite connected. I'm also a trans activist and a blogger. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about some of my research today. So I thought I would start by giving you some vocabulary and some definitions that I'll be using. So first of all, definition of transgender woman. A trans woman is someone who was assigned male at birth but self-identifies as female. Transphobia is a dislike or prejudice against transgender people, and cisgender is people who are not transgender, so basically most people. I also want to give you a definition of neoliberalism. We're not going to talk much about economics today, but we will be talking a little bit about the idea of neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is an economic system in the USA and Europe, and also many other countries now since the 1980s. It's a deregulated, low-tax economy, and the result is huge economic inequality, at least in Britain and the USA. Culturally, and this is where it's important to my research, the idea is that in neoliberalism is that we live in a society where anybody can be anything if they try hard enough. And I think that's a very important concept in relation to trans identity, as we will see now. So, Yessie, next slide, please, Yessie, thanks. So just to give you some background, I think I started getting the idea to do a PhD between 2012, 2016. It was like almost the new golden age of trans identity. A lot of famous people came out as trans, and a lot of films, a lot of books. For example, Lana Wachowski, the director, Laura Jane Grace, the punk musician, a lot of great TV shows like Transparent. So it was really a good time, I thought, to write about and study transgender narratives. However, one thing I did begin to realize is that these were representations that were created in the media. And the problem with this is that most of the representations are white and middle class. And that meant that a lot of representations, a lot of narratives were not being covered, and a lot of issues were not being discussed. So yeah, I became more and more interested in the relationship between trans identity and representation and power. And so my research is also to do with this idea of power and whose stories are. Yessie? Yeah, so for example, 2014 was a really important year for trans identity in relation to the media. Time magazine, they did a big story on Laverne Cox and transgender rights as this big new movement in society. However, there seems to be a disconnection between this kind of coverage and the lives of real transgender women. And we see this especially with some trans women of color who started talking about how trans politics and trans media coverage, it didn't really reflect their lives. As Janet Mock said in a really important statement. Yessie, next slide, please. Yeah, she talked about how there is the right kind of trans woman. I'll just read what she says. I have been held up consistently as a token, as the right kind of trans woman, educated, able-bodied, attractive, articulate, heteronormative. It promotes the delusion that because I made it, that level of success is easily accessible to all young trans women. Let's be clear, it is not. And Janet Mock, like many trans women of color in the USA and in Britain, talked about how the representations are usually white and middle class, and they don't deal with racism, they don't deal with mass incarceration, they don't deal with class issues. Lots of things are not discussed when transgender representation is in media. And as a result, a lot of trans narratives are excluded. Yeah, so to give you an example, another example, Yessie, another slide, please. João Gabriel, who is the cultural theorist, I really like his work. He's a transgender writer from Guadeloupe and then France. I think now he's based in the USA. And he talks about the white middle class narrative that dominates trans representation. So he says, trans women of color in France are disproportionately represented as victims of murders. But these are not solely transphobic, but they follow from a formidable overlap of situations of domination, such as poverty, violence resulting from the criminalization of sex work, experiences of homelessness and life in the streets, and incarceration. And again, these are not the narratives that we normally hear in the mainstream. Usually the mainstream narratives are really happy, positive stories about equal marriage. It doesn't talk about structural issues. And another person who I admire a great deal also talked about these things, Jamie Baruch. And Jamie Baruch is a Mexican transgender woman writing in the USA. And she talks about the multiple crises to transgender women of color in the USA and the violence, that is, I'll quote, the violence done to us and the people in our lives, recurring financial crises with roots so deep in the interconnected poison wells of capitalism, anti-blackness, white supremacy, and settler colonialism that we never truly escape them. So Baruch, she's a writer and an editor and an artist. She writes a lot about the racism in the USA and the fact that for trans women of color, they don't really, in their particular communities, they're not talking about equal marriage rights or whatever. They're talking about police brutality. They're talking about Black Lives Matter. And these issues, for the longest time, were ignored in LGBT spaces. So that we understand this big gap between white middle-class LGBT representation, including trans representation, and the reality of for trans women of color. And in the next slide as well, Baruch talks about the kind of representations that will be seen in the media and in cinema and in literature. And she describes them as bland, neoliberal, faux universal. So basically narratives which apply to everybody. They are like life stories. cis hetero people of color life. And so she's very critical of publishing and of the film industries, and says that they will only allow stories which are amenable to white middle class narratives. And so that leads me to my focus today on the film A Fantastic Woman. So I'd like to just talk briefly about these two things that I'm going to talk about. So A Fantastic Woman is a film that was released in 2017 in Chile, and the actress is now one of the big stars in cinema, certainly from a trans perspective, Daniela Vega. And it became a huge film. It won Best Foreign Film in Hollywood in the Oscars. And yeah, I'm going to talk about that and why I think that it became so popular and so successful. And then I'm going to compare it just a little bit with a documentary that I thought was really important in the way that in some ways it was excluded from access to British audiences. And I think the difference between these two films is really important. So first of all, I'd like to talk about A Fantastic Woman. Yeah, so A Fantastic Woman, it's first of all, it's a fantastic film. It's really about a 21st century transgender woman. It deals with really important issues. It deals with transphobia, including violence against transgender people. It deals with the problems of bureaucracy that transgender women can face. Some other really sophisticated things happen in this film. For example, it does not mention sex change operations, which is unusual, because normally Hollywood fictions and that journey from one gender to the next, and that is usually at the core of any transgender story in the mainstream. But Fantastic Woman is different. It kind of rejects this narrative, and that makes it a very powerful film and a very nuanced film. Finally, I also like this film because of the gaze of the actress and the character. The character is Marina, played by Vega. Usually with transgender representations in film, the transgender character is very shy, is very unassertive. She's often hiding her eyes. For example, a good example is The Danish Girl, starring Eddie Redmayne, where you have this very coy transgender woman who never really looks people in the eyes, or not very often. She's always very shy and unconfident. It's almost like this hyper-feminine kind of representation. Whereas Daniela Vega's performance, she absolutely looks into people's eyes. She looks into the camera. It's very powerful acting. It's a very political statement almost of this trans character who has total confidence in her own identity. And this is a remarkable achievement of the film. Oh, yes, please, sorry. However, there are some things I also want to talk about why I think this film is also so successful. Yes, it is very good in all kinds of ways, but I also think it's a very neoliberal narrative that this film has, and which helped it become so successful. So, for example, we have this approximately middle-class identity of the main character. She's upwardly mobile, so she goes from being just a singer and a waitress, but a singer in a kind of cabaret routine in a hotel, to singing in this almost operatic grand auditorium by the end. And you can see the way that she has improved her circumstances towards the end of the film. We have this personal arc. She's also young and beautiful in terms of cisgender beauty, I think. And the film kind of plays with this idea that she's not useful to some people. Some people think she's ugly. But other times, this issue kind of disappears from the film. She has no problem working as a waitress, for example, which is not a luxury that many trans women have. It's work. She's another thing that's really remarkable about this character. She's very talented. She has a great voice. And I think this is remarkable because for transgender women, many transgender women, it's not that easy to kind of just transition that part of you to have voice therapy and then to become like an outstandingly talented singer. So this is an extraordinary trans woman. She's not a normal kind of ordinary trans woman who has many of the issues and the problems that many trans women have. She has many talents that allow her to assimilate in society that I think make her journey much easier than would otherwise be the case. And finally, I think the ending is really important. By the end, she moves to this different apartment and to a different situation. And you don't really hear much. In fact, you don't hear anything about how she got this new apartment. It's just something easy that happens. And because at the beginning of the film, she's living with her boyfriend in his apartment. And then at the end, suddenly she's moved to this other place, no problem. And I found that a really interesting conclusion to the film in relation to the idea of property and private space. And the fact that she's able to get accommodation so easily. So I found those things quite telling about this film, that it's a narrative where she continually works on her own to get the things that she needs. She doesn't deal a lot with her family. She basically moves away from her sister, who is always arguing and squabbling with her husband. So she's always ending up alone to solve her own problems. And I think, again, it's the emphasis on the individual rather than on solidarity and community. And in a different way, I'd like to talk about Miss Maria Skirting the Mountain. So this is a documentary that came out the same year. And of course, as a documentary, it's going to have a different type of arc anyway. It's not going to be so dramatic. Nevertheless, I found it a really interesting documentary. This is a very different kind of trans woman. She's not young, for example. She's in her late 40s, I believe, and she works in subsistence agriculture. Her life is very tough. She lives in this very, very small hut-like home, and her life is really difficult. She clearly has a terrible time from her local community, faces a lot of abuse. And this narrative that we see in the documentary, it really contrasts. And I think, yes, we have a 21st century representation, but it's a very different kind of trans female experience. She's isolated in a rural setting. She's amongst the peasantry and the poverty. She has no escape from this situation. She can't just move to another apartment. The ending of the documentary, her life is pretty much the same, exactly the same as at the beginning. She continues to do what she was always doing. And it's a really interesting representation in that this is far away from LGBT politics. You think of things like equality politics, equal marriage, hate crimes legislation. None of those kind of legislations at a national level is going to help Miss Maria, this person living in the foothills of Colombia. Her life is really dependent on her community and whether they can accept her, whether they can live with her. And what was really interesting about the documentary is after it's finished, there are many documentaries on YouTube which show how the people of the local town of Boa Vita, I think it's called, they began to accept her, having seen the documentary. They began to understand her. And it showed this community project, the documentary working as a community project, really brought them together. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of dynamic in the way that a trans person can work with her community. It's an absolutely very different kind of life and conclusion to what we see in A Fantastic Woman. And so I want to talk about some quick conclusions about A Fantastic Woman and about Miss Maria. First of all, A Fantastic Woman is commercially successful, partly because it represents transgender women in a way that conforms to neoliberal ideals, of female identity. Glamorous, urban, talented, upwardly mobile, individualistic, no need for family or social networks. She can pass as a beautiful cisgender woman, and she goes on to great things. And I think even though the film is very good and very skillful and very sophisticated, I think these extra qualities certainly help it to become the kind of film that a cisgender audience can accept. Differently, I'd like to just talk about Miss Maria and how because the reason it's less commercially successful, I believe, is because it focuses on the life of a trans woman who is not young or has cisgender beauty. There is no dramatic personal arc to her life. Her peasant life remains the same from the beginning to the end. She cannot leave her community or change her circumstances. Social solidarity is vital to her existence. She is lonely and depends on her community. And it's really interesting how that contrasts with the film A Fantastic Woman. It's not a film where you leave your community behind, but in fact, it's a film about solidarity. And I think those are not really neoliberal themes, and they are not particularly dramatic or exciting themes, but they are themes that are very important to a lot of people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. And the difference between these two representations did make me think about an analysis by a theorist, a historian called Oscar Guardiola Rivera, who was writing about South America and the way that neoliberalism has been introduced with the support of the USA. And he first of all analyzes neoliberalism as, and I quote, emerged a conception of human rights as purely individual rights claimed in advance of the state, and in particular rights to property and industry. And I think that's definitely something you can see in A Fantastic Woman. Ultimately, the conclusion of the film is she has this apartment and she has this upgraded position as a singer. Whereas if we go to Guardiola Rivera's comment about a different kind of society to neoliberalism, he says, and I quote, another conception of human rights is people's rights, closer to the establishment of the right to self-determination and a moral politics of solidarity at the heart of third world discourses of liberation. And this issue of solidarity, we see it much more as at the core of Miss Maria. And I think it makes it a very interesting documentary about working together, people needing each other. And so I think that contrast is really interesting when we compare the respective success of A Fantastic Woman with the documentary Miss Maria, because Miss Maria as a documentary is almost impossible to get. After I watched it in a film festival in 2017, it disappeared, and I tried contacting the distributors and they wouldn't provide it, except for, I think it was like £300, £400. It was basically impossible to get hold of. And in the end, I had to write about it without actually being able to refer to it. So I think the fact that it is so difficult to get such a documentary, whereas Fantastic Woman, you can get it, with £5 or £10 on Amazon with next day delivery. It shows the kind of representations that we get from the Americas and the kind that conform to a kind of ideology, and those that we don't see that show a very different kind of representation. So yeah, would you like me to stop talking now? I could talk a little bit about Pedro Lemebel, or do you want me to stop? I could talk for 5 minutes more. Yeah, okay. So partly through Yessi, I got to know the work of Pedro Lemebel and his novel or novella, My Tender Matador. And I was really interested with this work because of the way it represents gender, almost in a way where transgender the concept it's almost like a pre-transgender novel dealing with gender ambiguity, and it's a really interesting representation. And to some degree, it reminded me a lot of another novel by Manuel Puig from Argentina called Is almost playing with the audience, with the reader. He doesn't give too much information about this person. It's very difficult to tell what the gender is. And you can do this in literature. You can hide the gender to some degree in terms of either not using pronouns by just using dialogues, or in this novel, not giving too much information. Yeah, and I just wanted to compare it very quickly to Kiss of the Spider Woman, because I know now that they are releasing a film of My Tender Matador. So I wanted to talk about how Kiss of the Spider Woman had problems making that shift from the novel to the movie, because in Kiss of the Spider Woman, you have a kind of transgender character, but you're not totally clear. Is it just someone who's gay and feminine, very feminine, and who identifies with some female aspects, or is this person transgender? And it was a big debate in academia about this character called Molina. But then, and because the book is very Socratic, it has a dialogue. It's just two people talking in a cell. Basically, this kind of transgender character plus this very macho revolutionary, and they're very suspicious of each other, but they just have a conversation with each other, and they begin to learn to know each other. But of course, when they made the film, the film had to produce something clear for the audience, because cinema is a visual medium, and it was really interesting to see how they dealt with it. The character of Molina was no longer ambiguous. It's almost like they had to decide, is Molina a gay man or is Molina transgender? And ultimately, they go with gay man. And so in the film, which won an Oscar in 1985, I think you can see the picture here. William Hurt, the American actor who plays Molina, he won an award, but by very much playing this kind of gay man who also says that he'd like to be a woman. It's basically almost an affinity rather than an identification. And I think the making of this film is really interesting, because it's clear that the director and the production team, they hadn't seen the actor when he arrived for this production, and they were shocked by how big and strong he was. And they thought it was going to create all kinds of problems for the production, that no one would believe that he was this very feminine gay person. In fact, at one point, they even thought about switching the actors, because they thought that the feminine actor looked more masculine than the masculine actor. And because of the importance of visibility and visualization with gender, that it would just ruin the film. And it's interesting, some of the things that, for example, the director, Hector Babenco, saying to William Hurt, the actor, when he first saw him, "You look like a soccer player. You have a gigantic body, plenty of muscles. You could easily be a boxer." It's almost like the director was angry when the actor arrived. And it's clear that they wanted this actor so that the film would be successful in the USA. So they had this big American star. But at the same time, they just thought it would not work. And so they got a choreographer called Mara Borba to work with William Hurt to try and make him more feminine. And Mara Borba says, I watched, it's impossible. We cannot make this person look like he's either gay or that he wants to be a woman. But then they started to work together, Mara Borba and the actor William Hurt. And William Hurt said, and I quote, "We would analyze the difference between a woman's pelvic area and a man's and the way the spine works. And she understood it all. She was the one who helped me find Molina." And what I think is fascinating is the way that they had to visually construct this feminine identity with this actor in order to make the film work in a way which was not an issue with the book. So what I'm trying to show here is the fact that it's actually really difficult to make this shift from a book which has a gender ambiguous character to a film level. And that's why I'm really interested in seeing the film of My Tender Matador by story, well, adapted from the novel by Pedro Lemebel, because I want to see, will they portray this very ambiguous character as another gay man or as a transgender character? And as we can see from the pictures of the character, it looks like they're moving more towards this kind of potentially trans drag queen kind of character. And I'm looking forward to seeing how they will deal with it, because I'm fascinated by the way that films try to adapt gender ambiguous characters and the decisions they have to make one way or the other, and whether the fact that we now live in a more transgender friendly kind of world, whether they will go down a transgender route with this character. So I just wanted to say that because I'm really excited about the film and I can't wait to see it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Gina, for that presentation. So we will start our conversation now. So I would appreciate if you have any questions to ask Gina. I don't know, Gina, if you can see, but they're clapping virtually.
Oh. Thank you.
So congratulations. Thank you very, very much for your analysis of those films and books that are very interesting. We have discussed them before, and it's nice to see you talking about all of them together, because some of them we have even watched together, so it's nice.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say, because I know sometimes it's difficult to ask questions about books or films that you haven't seen. So if people just want to ask questions about what it's like in Scotland and Britain to be transgender at university, or just general questions, they can ask those questions too.
Thank you. So please raise your hand if you have any questions. You can ask them yourselves.
No.
Any hands? No? Malena said something in the chat. I appreciate the references to our local literary production and social cultural statements in our currently convulsive local moment. Yes, thank you very much, actually. Gabriel has a question or a comment. So Gabriel, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to remove my hand. No, it's down. Okay. Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting to hear your point of view and how mass media and how the film industry represents, like how it represents identity, especially in this case, transgender identity. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's a question. I think it's more than a comment, what I'm going to say, but I just found it very interesting, because even though I think I really liked A Fantastic Woman, and I really appreciated that in a society that's so conservative like Chile, such a film was very well received, and it started like to open the discussion towards the inclusion of transgender people in Chile. But there is also this, there is like a shade that defines which kind, depending on how you look, which kind of people be accepted and which not. The comparison between this documentary from Colombia, I think it was, you said, yeah, and transgender women, it was very clear how neoliberal standards or the politics of beauty have permeated into culture, into our subconscious, into how we perceive people. And yeah, I'm very looking forward to watch the film again, the film adaptation. Tengo Miedo Torero, I forget the name in English, but in Spanish it's Tengo Miedo Torero. It's one of my favorite books, and I think it depicts a very crude life story of a person that has been discriminated back in history here in Chile, situated in a dictatorship, in a very controversial, very conservative, as I said, Latin American country. So I'm very expectant how the film is going to portray this. And I wanted to say as well, like just to comment, because I remember, I always remember about a very important, at least for me, topic that covered a Chilean activist that today she's unfortunately dead, and she was called Hija de Perra. That she was an artist that she talks about as well, about these politics of beauty and whether you will be accepted in a society depending on your social class, because she was a working class transgender woman, and as well how your appearance is going to define how you're going to be treated by society. So it was a very tough, a very like mind expanding, and I don't know. I don't know. There are a lot of emotions that arise when you think about that.
Absolutely. And I agree as well. I'm really excited about My Tender Matador because it also deals with dictatorship. And I think that is something that we don't talk about much in Britain or in the USA, the influence of the USA in relation to these dictatorships, and whether this film will be successful in showing a dictatorship, or how much will it show. And I know in the book it doesn't go into depth with this. It's almost like a satire of dictatorship as well, which is very funny in its representation. But I personally, that was one of the things I wanted to do with my research as well, because we talk a lot about South America in Britain in terms of trans identity. We have the most important social event of the year in Britain and in the USA. It's called Trans Day of Remembrance. I think it's at the end of November 21st or something. And basically we commemorate all the trans women who have been murdered. And most of them are from Brazil. And I've been to these candle-lit vigils. I've even organized them without really understanding why these trans women were dying. And often the narrative is, oh, it's the culture of machismo, or it's the Catholic Church. And those are usually the two primary reasons given, but we never talk about the instabilities created in many countries in Latin America by the USA, and also supported by Britain. And so it's, again, there are particular narratives, apolitical narratives. And when I say apolitical, I think no mention of politics. The trans representation needs to be free from political discussions. So it's interesting to see a film based on a story by Pedro Lemebel, who is very political, and how it will treat this. And I would love to see more representations which deal with geopolitical issues, because I think one thing that happens when you get dictatorships is you get LGBT communities being absolutely destroyed in this culture of machismo and conservatism. And a lot of it comes from this, for me, this kind of imperialism. And we don't talk about this relationship between foreign policy and the femicide and the oppression of LGBT people and indigenous groups as well. So that's why I'm also excited that Lemebel's work could get a bigger audience, because he deals with some really big issues as well as with LGBT issues. So yeah, I'm really excited for all kinds of reasons.
Thank you, Gabriel, and thank you, Gina. Are there any other questions or comments? Steffi?
Yes.
Hello,
everybody. Thank you, Gina, for your presentation. I would like to ask, I'm sorry if I make some mistakes. I haven't used my English in a very long time. But I would like to ask about your opinion about the effect or yeah, about the effect that can have on the vision that we can portray of transgender people when we see usually on TV or movies or even some books, like the trans people are the bad ones. Like I started to remember the Silence of the Lambs, if I'm not mistaken, in which the criminal is trans, or maybe no, in many like police series, the prostitutes are trans people, the bad ones are trans people. So many of us grew up seeing trans maybe like bad people, and it's not. It's just the portray that television and maybe media has and give us. So what's your...
Yeah, I agree completely. So what you're talking about is actually a historical process, I think, because in the 20th century, yeah, for sure, the representations were terrible. I think the really famous example as well, you talked about Silence of the Lambs in 1991. Also, Psycho, the film by Alfred Hitchcock with the kind of shower scene. These are the kind of representations that people began to associate with transgender women. And partly, I think it's a cinematic effect, because they want to show someone who's crazy and dangerous. And visually, transgender people can give this to a director if the director wants to do this. But of course, it has terrible consequences for transgender communities. And I'm really grateful that in the 1990s, a transgender movement started to happen, certainly in the USA, where the word transgender started to become this political movement. Plus, we had the internet, and it spread into Britain. Maybe it's true in Latin America, where now people are more careful in their representation of transgender women and transgender people. They cannot do what they used to do. Now there are more consequences. Now they will get a kind of a social media blitz on social media, on Twitter and so on, from transgender activists. So now it's more difficult for people to make films like Silence of the Lambs. At least I hope it's more difficult. But you've identified a really negative historical dynamic. And I don't know if it's different in Latin America, but for sure in Britain and in Hollywood, I think they would be much more careful now in how they would show a transgender woman. But it still needs to improve, that's for sure. But thank you.
Thank you, Steffi, and thank you, Gina. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question or make a comment? Malena, you want to go?
I really don't want to take anyone else's time, if there is anyone else.
Moni also raised her hand. Do you want
Go
her
ahead.
to go first?
Go ahead, Moni.
Okay, Moni, go.
It's a very brief question, actually. And thank you for your presentation. It's very, very interesting. I want to know a little bit more about the PhD you're doing. If it's like, if it has like a specific focus on something, or I don't know.
Say the last part again, please.
If it has a specific focus on something, I don't know, education, or it's, I don't know.
And the focus changed a lot. So to begin with, I was going to focus on 21st century text in film and in literature. And then I realized how white and middle class my representations were. So then halfway through my PhD, I changed the focus completely and focused instead on literature, especially by trans women of color in the USA. People like Jamie Baruch, C.C. MacDonald, Mary Curzato, who's she's not trans, but she's queer indigenous. So these kind of narratives outside the white middle class, and what they show about class and about things like mass incarceration and racism in the USA. And I'm really interested in going beyond this kind of LGBT politics, which only talks about military service or gay marriage or whatever, or trans marriage, and dealing with bigger issues. So I think that's really my focus. It's a focus on transgender narratives that are not represented, usually because they're outside of white middle class norms. And so I don't know if that gives you a clearer idea, but so I focus mainly on artists in the USA who write about things like racism and police brutality and capitalism, the kind of narratives that don't fit into neoliberalism. So that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Moni. Thank you, Gina. So we have like around 10 minutes left for this conversation. So if you have a question, now's the time. Ale?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, well, first of all, thank you for the presentation and the conversation. It has been very illuminating, so thank you for that. And I wanted to ask you about J.K. Rowling, because you're British. And so if you guys don't know, she made some comments about transgender women, and she has been doing this for a while now. And I'm a very big fan of Harry Potter. And so it sort of clashes with what to do, because she has such a great audience. And then she goes and says things like that. And I don't know how to feel. I mean, I still love my books, but I'm conflicted with her comments and what to do in that situation. And so I wanted to see what you think about it and what is your response, I guess.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that question. It's been a big issue in Britain, and it has created lots of big discussions on things like cancel culture. There have been accusations that trans people are trying to silence debate, are trying to silence people, which is crazy because J.K. Rowling has so much influence. She's always in the newspapers, in the media, and transgender activists don't have this platform. But okay, specifically to this situation, I was upset by the media representation of J.K. Rowling's words, because so in Scotland, for example, two newspapers, one called The Scotsman and one called The National, they made opinion pieces about this story, and they said, oh, J.K. Rowling, all she said is that women can menstruate and women are just biological. That's all she said. And I was really upset about this because that's not all J.K. Rowling said. J.K. Rowling, for example, in this very big essay, 3,500 words, 5 main points, plus lots of other points. Some of the comments she made was, for example, that this person called Maya Forstarter had lost a trial where she was fighting for the right to misgender transgender people in the workplace. She wanted the right to call transgender women men and transgender men women, and she wanted this as a right in the workplace, and she lost. And transgender people are very happy that she lost, because that would have made things unbearable. And J.K. Rowling supported her in this big essay. She also just generally connected trans women with violence against women. If you let trans women into public spaces like toilets, then there will be violence against women. Made lots of kind of dog whistle connections. There were lots of reasons why it was not a very nice essay that J.K. Rowling wrote. But the media, right across the board, like The Guardian, which is like one of the biggest newspapers, plus all these Scottish newspapers, they showed her as a victim, and they showed trans people as like monsters, that trans activists are these online kind of warriors that are trying to destroy people. And it was really unfair. And I wrote 2 articles, one to The Scotsman and one to The National, and said, can you please publish my alternative thing to balance the representation? and they wouldn't. They didn't show any counter narrative. So all these newspapers in Britain took J.K. Rowling's side and represented her as just someone very reasonable and rational and a victim, and have tried to show trans people as just crazy. And even in The Guardian, like every time they reference J.K. Rowling, they say, Rowling, who has made many trans people angry by saying that women menstruate. It's like, it's never been about menstruation. It's about all these other things that she said. And so it's very frustrating and it's very upsetting. And The Guardian newspaper, which is one of the biggest newspapers in Britain, I read somewhere that it has published 100 stories in the last year on trans identity, none of them by transgender people. And this is like a left-wing newspaper. The right-wing newspapers are even worse. So basically, trans people have no voice in the British media, and it's really frustrating and it's really upsetting. And all we have is basically universities and Twitter, but all the main media on TV and newspapers and people like J.K. Rowling, they have so much more power. And it's really unfair the way that they misrepresent trans people as being like monsters or crazy activists. And a lot of the comments that are made in the media, J.K. Rowling and other people, it's so uninformed. It's stuff like, I don't want children to have sex change operations. You can't have a sex change operation until you're 18. Everyone knows this. It's illegal. But they will say this, and then the newspapers will make a story out of it. So the media, I think what it is, there's also a bigger problem here. It's to do with clickbait culture with the media. So basically what works on Twitter, what gets lots of clicks and likes and interests is what becomes the news. And so now transgender people are the #1 clickbait kind of target. It used to be foreigners, and now we've got Brexit. So now foreigners are not such a threat. So the next big social enemy is transgender people. And everyone's getting scared of transgender people, that they're really dangerous. It's a good way of telling newspapers, but it is extremely dangerous to do this because transgender women are being attacked. Even women who look like gender non-conforming, like cisgender women who might just be quite butch, they go into women's toilets and they get attacked now. So what is the consequences of this are extremely dangerous when J.K. Rowling and these people try to make trans women look like they are monsters. There are consequences for all kinds of women, not just transgender women. So to conclude, I'm very frustrated by the way that the British media in the last 3 years especially has decided to represent transgender women especially as this kind of social monster. And it's now, I think Britain is one of the worst countries in the global north in representing trans people. And yeah, it's very frustrating. But yeah, so thank you for your question.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Ali. A controversial topic. Moni was suggesting that we should separate art from the artist, what I think is very important as well in a case like this. But thank you very much. Daniela, you had your hand raised as well. Do you want to ask something?
No, mine is like a comment actually. That I just wanted to thank Gina for their time and for their presentation. Also for the comparison between the film and the documentary. I haven't been able to see the film yet, but it gives me a lot to think about it and a completely different look at why the film was so popular, and just think that it's something important to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela.
Thank you, Dani. We have one more person that raised her hand, Denise, but before we had a question on Facebook that Giovanna sent. She says, thank you very much for your presentation. I enjoyed it very much. We live in a very close-minded country, and there are still people who think about transgender or the LGBT LGBT, I guess, community as if they had no voice. It's amazing now how this type of movie or book shows us that support is everything. It is always everything. No matter the century, it will always be everything. What do you think of the evolution of people's mentality? I want to believe that we moved forward, but as we get more information, it becomes more dangerous. What do you think about the evolution of people's mentality, Gina?
Yeah, so if you had asked me this question like 3 years ago, I would have said that progress is like linear. We are moving in a good direction. But I think now what I'm seeing is things are cyclical as well, where, and we can see it historically, transgender people historically, in the past, people didn't even write about transgender people. And now we have the media and they are writing about transgender people. But I think the way that social media works now and the way that it influences the news, things are getting worse in Britain. It's really interesting. I can develop this point and tell you why it kind of happened as well. Up until about 2015, 2016 in Britain, things were getting quite good in the USA and in Britain. And then in Scotland and in England and in Wales, they began to try to introduce a new legislation called the Gender Recognition Act, which allowed transgender people to self-identify, but they didn't need a doctor to say that they are transgender. And this is what really started the big war. And some women's groups, some, but not all, said, yeah, we are a little bit scared about this development. We need to talk about it more. But that just started this big media campaign. And I think the media saw just how powerful, how popular this discussion is, to have a transgender woman on the show and have an argument with her and stuff and treat her as a monster. So I think things are not as good as I thought they were. And I see almost like I'm not blaming anybody particularly. I think it's almost like it has its own dynamic, its own momentum, the way that a particular minority just becomes commercially a very viable thing if they become turned into monsters, and because people want to read about dangerous things. And I think that's where we're at in Britain increasingly. In Hungary, they've banned transgender identity. In Poland as well, in Eastern Europe, it is going that way. Of course, in Russia, it's already a really bad thing. So I think throughout Europe right now, we are seeing a lot of conservative governments, a lot of populist governments in the USA as well. And I don't know if this is a cyclical thing, and then in the next cycle, when we get left-wing governments, things will get better again, and then we will go back in this cycle. I hope that things get better, but I'm less optimistic than I was 3 years ago in seeing the way that very intelligent journalists jump onto this bandwagon and attack transgender identity, saying things that they must know are not correct. When you see this happening, you know that people and their intelligence and stuff, they can say anything, and it can be really dangerous. So I hope, but I'm not confident that things are going to get better.
Thank you, Gina. So we are running out of time, but I think we still have time, Gina, to answer a couple more questions of Denise, and maybe one more person. Malena, you wanted to say something as well? So if we're going to accept only 3 more questions, Denise, Malena, and one more in case you want to say something to Gina. Denise, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Gina. Thank you so much for sharing that presentation. It was very interesting. So basically, I just wanted to ask you, most of us, like the majority of us, are going to become like we're going to be future teachers. And basically, I just wanted to ask you if you have any like recommendations or like advice to start this conversation with students? And like you said that solidarity is very important, and how can we help our students to embrace diversity?
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Because we know that we are like inside the classroom, we are like, we have a big impact on our students. So I just wanted to like see.
Okay, no, this is a really good question. And I think people in every university all over the world are asking the same question. So it's something that needs to be discussed everywhere. In Edinburgh University, for example, a couple of things that some teachers do and some lecturers do, they introduce themselves with their pronouns. You know, so for example, my name's Dr. Gina Meyer, my pronouns are she, her. And if the lecturer or teacher introduces themselves like this, then it gives people more confidence that they can similarly introduce themselves with their pronouns. And when you have emails, at the bottom of the email, you will have your name and then you will have your pronouns. And again, it's kind of a signal to people, especially trans people, that they realize that you understand them and their issues. And it's always a very positive feeling when you see someone with that in their email address, the she, her, or he, him kind of pronouns, or they, them. One thing that they did at Edinburgh University as well, they had these lanyards, you know, where you have your card, and it's like a thing around your neck. And it was a rainbow lanyard, and it became very popular. So all around the university, you saw all these teachers. In fact, I can show you one. Just stay there. I'm just going to get one.
Thank you. In the meantime, Pedro also had a question, so we're going to close with that one.
Oh, this is a rainbow lanyard. And you put this around your neck, and it has keys on it or something. So that's the lanyard, and it's LGBT kind of rainbow. So there we go.
Thank you. So
Thank you.
Malena and then Pedro. Pedro goes first? Okay, Pedro, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, hi Gina, nice to meet you. This is my first time ever using this Zoom platform, so I'm sorry if I'm not able to manage it well. My comment is very related to Dennis's question. I'm a language teacher also, and I'm currently working in an international school, which unfortunately is kind of very conservative. And although, let's say, doors are very close to people who are identified as transgender students, I used to have transgender students in the past, and I kind of like not disagree with what you said about evolution, but when I think of evolution, I think of these new generations of people, these new generations of students that are very open-minded, and they've got very, you know, values and comments that I didn't listen when I was a kid. And so I think of them as the future of humanity, the future of our people. I haven't taught them everything I know about transgender or gender studies because I don't have to. They already know. Their parents have done their homework. I know this is not a reality in every single school in Chile, but when I had to work in a public school, we concentrated one of the biggest population with transgender students. I don't know why, but most parents whose child or kids were transgender, they applied to the school who was very open to every single culture, every single reality, and it was very good. And I learned a lot, and I could see that we are, even though I'm in a very small city compared to Edinburgh, but I do think we are living nowadays a new future of generations of humans. And I'm very proud to say it. And I can tell you, perhaps you don't see it very frequently in your reality, but I can tell you that at least in this tiny and thinner country of the world, we are living this situation. Not in every country, I know this is very different, but at least in my case, I've been experiencing that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Pedro. And I just wanted to add, for sure, there's a big generational divide in Britain, as in other countries. We saw it with the Brexit vote and the vote to leave the European Union. And with the general election, older people voting Conservative, younger people far more on the left, and far more understanding of Black Lives Matter, LGBT rights, and so on. So there is a big generational gap happening everywhere. But you're right, the younger new generations, millennials, Generation Z, they are far more advanced and sophisticated than my generations were. So it's in this respect, there is much to be optimistic about. I agree.
Thank you, Pedro and Gina. Malena?
Okay, hi Gina, thank you so much. This is so interesting and it's so lovely to see so many of our students so excited about content and mixing it with language, right? With this other language we speak. My question, we couldn't leave, guys. Don't think we were gonna leave without addressing how this may relate to language. And I'm going to take advantage to the fact of you just told me at the beginning that you are interested in multilingualism and language as maybe part of identity. I don't know, that is part of my question. And I'd like you to address Denise's question on how we can help our students or acoger, how do we say that? Or allow our students and help our students embrace diversity by putting language at the center. So how can we use the fact of learning another language? Can we, maybe the question is, can we do that? And if we can, how can we do that in order for the people who are different, feel different, want to be different, are developing a particular identity that may not be the mainstream, in order to do that and feel welcome, accepted, validated, and what should we be careful about language-wise?
Okay, wow. It's a big question, and of course, it's a very interesting question. So what I would say, there is a big debate in Britain right now on what we call decolonizing the curriculum, because the British curriculum in schools and universities is dominated by generally white men, British men. Yeah, in fact, when I went to school and university, we never even studied South American literature. And I think this is kind of normal. Most British people, even at a university, even at PhD level, they don't read South American literature. They don't read African literature or Indian or from, throughout the world. And I think if you don't do that, what you end up having is a very parochial, narrow kind of view of identity. And I think one of the keys to helping students is by decolonizing a curriculum, by having lots of different narratives from different linguistic positions and different cultures. Because in terms of trans identity, I mean, trans comes from North America, right, as a concept, but there are way more other transgender identities. I mean, in North America, you have indigenous two-spirit identity. You have in India, you have Hijra. In Africa, you have several different gender identities that people don't think about because because the colonizing impact of the word transgender. That's the thing about LGBT politics. It is very colonizing in its own way, and it gives us one view of gender identity, separate but still the same, connected to this kind of white kind of culture. So I think it's about looking at different texts, just finding different texts from different countries, dealing with identities in different ways, and then dealing with this in classrooms and saying, okay, what does this tell us about gender and about, even when we think we're being radical, the fact that the colonizing impact of these mainstream kind of radical concepts of LGBT and stuff. So I think decolonizing a curriculum is one thing that I would definitely say is important. Does that help to answer your question?
Thank you.
Thank you, Gina and Malena. So just to start closing this activity, I wanted to share a comment by Constanza, who had to leave. She apologized for not being here until but she had a class. She thanks you for your talk and also recommends a movie called Girl. She says you can find it on Netflix. I don't know if you've heard of it. Have you watched it?
Yes.
Should you? Would you recommend it or not?
No.
No. Okay. Interesting. Well, now I want to watch it.
You want me to talk about it briefly? I can tell you why.
Briefly? Okay, go ahead.
It is this. Yeah, it's the one. It's from the Netherlands or Belgium. But anyway, it's this castration narrative. It's about this person who's transitioning into becoming a beautiful woman, and at the end, it has one of the worst scenes that I have ever seen in a film. It is horrific. It is gruesome. It is. I don't want to say too much. And when I sat in the cinema, I couldn't believe what I was watching. And I think trans communities in Europe and the USA were shocked by how bad the final scenes were, how shockingly brutal. And it was made by a director who is cisgender, who said that he based it on the experience of a transgender person. But that transgender person did not suffer the things that happen in that film. So I think it was a film that is typical of Hollywood in trying to return transgender identity to castration, physical castration and sex change. It is the opposite of A Fantastic Woman, for example, which is a much more sophisticated and positive representation. So I do not recommend Girl. I thought it was a horrific film to watch at the end. So that's me.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. So we are getting to the end of this activity. I would like to thank you, Gina, once again for your participation, for your presentation, for all your ideas and comments. So our audience is clapping again for you. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone that is here now for your questions, your comments, and your attention to this presentation and this conversation. I am really glad to have this opportunity to talk to Gina about this very important topic. So this is it. I hope we have the chance to talk again. Why not in the future? So we have some farewell comments, I guess, in the chat as well. Thank you, and then thanks Gina, all the best in your PhD, says Kathy. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It was very enjoyable. I loved talking with all of you. It was very stimulating, and good luck with all of you as well with your work and with your studies.
Thank you. So you can find the video if you missed a little bit. You can find the video on Facebook Live, and it will probably be on YouTube in the future as well. So Felipe says, thank you, Gina, all the best in your study. So thank you. Bye-bye.